I'm really sorry I can't be with you. Unfortunately, I'm not too well at the moment, so unable to travel, but I'm really pleased that at least I can talk to you virtually. Yeah, I want to talk about Gen AI and what it can do for adult learning and skills, but in particular, I want to think about how we might go about enabling Gen AI to really help us in the space of adult learning and skills. How do we prepare people? How do we engage people in understanding how to use these tools effectively in order to become more effective in the workplace, in order to learn more effectively? There's a lot here that I'd like to unpack. So I will start off by talking about a little about Gen AI. We need to, where we are now, the situation that we're facing at the moment. But then I really want to think about what we can do when it comes to adult learning and skills. And I'm going to address that what we can do question through 4 particular points. One about mindset, one about data understanding and how we might generate increased data understanding, which I think is really important for people if they're going to leverage these tools impactfully and effectively through using familiar learning concepts. Then I want to talk a little bit about how we can use examples and connect examples of data-driven actionable insights. And then a last point about collaboration. So let's get started without further ado. So where are we now? Well, we are a long way from where we started off with artificial intelligence, way back in the 1920s, you might say. But actually, even before the 1920s, as humans, we were obsessed with images of ourselves, automata, even though the word robot wasn't introduced until the 1920s. But I guess you might think of the birth of modern AI perhaps starting with the cybernetics and Norbert Wiener in the 1940s. But the point of this slide is to bring home that we are only where we are with these generative AI tools that were first released en masse in 2022 because of all that's gone before. And it's really important to remember that actually what's happened both in the last millennium and this is really important for where we are now. It's not just come out of nowhere. And so, yes, here we have a variety of the generative AI tools. Of course, there are loads of them now. These are just some of the more popular ones, perhaps. And they're very, very keen to help us. That's the first thing I think you notice. And they're very easy to use. And as the previous discussion, the conversation can be used for lots of different tasks, including writing cards to loved ones. But really, as I say, they are part of a much bigger story about artificial intelligence. And I think it's really important to remember where they sit within that bigger story. So in the last, in the 1950s to 2000, we were looking at good old-fashioned AI, rule-based systems, expert systems. A lot of people would not qualify them as AI, but I think they should fit within the broader definition of artificial intelligence. And then we moved into more modern AI, machine learning. So neural networks that help machines process masses of data so that they can learn. So our good old-fashioned AI didn't learn. You had to write rules, and if you wanted to change your system, you had to rewrite the rules. Modern AI, machine learning, can learn and learn from data. But what we have at the moment, whether it's generative AI or not, is still narrow AI. It focuses on a very specific task. We don't have artificial general intelligence, which would be AI that matches our own repertoire of human intelligence. So again, it's really important to remember where we are when it comes to generative AI, and that it's part of a much bigger story. And so yes, it's a subset of artificial intelligence. As I say, it uses machine learning algorithms. It's trained on huge amounts of data, can generate content similar to the data that it's been trained on, and it mimics the structure and style of whatever we want. It's incredibly useful, whether it's about images or about texts. But one thing that's really important to remember is that it's not connected to the real world. in the way that our own human intelligence is. So as we learn as individuals in the world, as children, and then as adults, we experience the world directly. And depending on which particular flavour of developmental psychology you favour, Piagetian or Vygotskian, you know that it's actually really important that you both have direct and indirect experience of the world, and there's an interplay between that direct and indirect experience that builds our human intelligence. So not only can we write a story about tables and chairs and gardens and trees, we can directly experience those things. This is not true for generative AI. It's manipulating tokens without any direct experience of the world, which is why you get some strange hallucinations and why you get some odd results on occasions, because the AI has no tacit knowledge of the world. And it's really important to remember that when we're thinking about how we use it and how it impacts on the world. And so in this last section, the last part of this first part of the talk about, where are we now? We're in a place that's a bit bumpy, to be honest with you. The landscape's changing very quickly. Every week, there's a new version of a generative AI model. There are new tools. There are new approaches to regulation. There's a lot happening in this space. But really, we're here because of a perfect storm of three things. And that is masses of data. Everywhere we go in the world, data is collected about us as we interact through our technology, but often through observation, CCTV, for example. So as we interact in the world, masses of data is collected about us. So we have access to huge data sources. The second ingredient in our perfect storm of three is processing power. We have technologies, computing technologies that have amazing processing power. The kind of processing power I had access to when I was a mere PhD student back in the 1990s is tiny in comparison to what just my mobile phone has now. We now have huge amounts of processing power. And then the final ingredient in that perfect storm are these really smart algorithms, the algorithms that can use that processing power to process that data and learn and create artificial intelligence systems that analyze their environment through that data and behave in ways that they've been trained to do. And that perfect storm is what's got us to where we are now when it comes to generative AI. So where does that leave us when it comes to adult learning and skills? How do we prepare people for a world where things are uncertain and we're not exactly sure where these technologies are going to go? To some extent, you can predict where the technology development may go in 1, 3, 5 years, if we take out a lot of hype that we're hearing at the moment, but it won't be precise. But we need to remember that even the people building those generative AI systems don't fully understand how they work, which is why you get lots of interesting research papers telling us about examples when the models behaved in a way that they weren't anticipating. But the really important thing is that even if we could predict what the technology might be capable of doing, we cannot predict how people will adopt and appropriate that technology. That's much more uncertain. And they may adopt it and appropriate for good reasons, and they may adopt it and appropriate it for bad reasons. But whatever, one thing is sure, we cannot predict precisely how this technology story is going to unfold. Again, as an educator, I find that scary. I don't like uncertainty. It's hard to think about how we prepare people for the workforce, for their lives, when we're in a place of such great uncertainty. We know that AI will be transformational. We don't know precisely how AI will be transformational, but we know that it will be. Lots of reports come out all of the time. This is an example from last year from the World Economic Forum, and there has been extreme concern raised about inequalities because, of course, people who have access to better technology, have access to higher quality models, are able to use the AI, and we get a greater gap between those who are proficient and those who are not. So there's a real concern about inequality in this space. And we need to think about
how we reduce the risks of that inequality through ensuring that our education workforce is, provided with appropriate professional development programs to help them become skilled in using these technologies. And I'll say a little bit more about how we might go about that at the end when I talk about collaboration. And this came up in the conversation that I was able to join just now. The power balance is really shifting. So at the moment, we can see that the technology companies have a huge amount of power. They are driving the conversation. We certainly need to help education as a sector have a much louder voice in what's going on. But we also need to recognise that agility is really important because things are changing so quickly. And whilst at the moment, I think it's still fair to say that efficiency is driving the way that people are appropriating these generative AI tools, I think there will be a much more radical change when we come up with new business models, which we're not really seeing yet. If we think about the equivalent with the internet, I mean, everybody does internet shopping now, it seems just the norm. But of course, before the internet existed, we didn't have it. And it was the likes of Jeff Bezos in a garage working out that he was going to sell books that brought about that new business model. So what will be the equivalent radical change that we will see as a result of these tools? I don't know, but we're not there yet. So at the moment, we're being driven more by efficiencies, but that may not be the direction of travel in years to come. And that means that change management becomes incredibly important. So thinking about, supporting colleagues, thinking about workforce development, we need to recognise that actually this is as much a story about change management as it is about skill development. Again, I'm going to come back to that point about change management earlier. But we definitely need to find a way of connecting the education sector more powerfully to the conversations about what AI is used to do within education, what AI is developed for the purposes of teaching and learning. So it's kind of where we are now, this rather uncertain, challenging, potentially exciting space. So what can we do? What can we do when it comes to thinking about adult learning, skills development? What are the practical actions that we can start thinking about taking now in order to help get the best from these AI tools that are available? Well, I think the first thing we need to think about is mindset. Now, yes, there's a small child on the cover of the book that I've just put on the screen, but this is a book that's not just about small children. It's a book that I wrote back in 2018. It's now out of copyright. You can download a free PDF if you're interested. I wrote the book because I was concerned that we were overestimating what our artificial intelligence could do and underestimating our own human intelligence. And I think if we were doing that back in 2017, when I was actually writing this book, we're doing it even more now. And I think it's really important that we focus on understanding much more about our human intelligence if we're really going to leverage these AI tools to the best effect for humanity. So we need to think carefully about what aspects of our human intelligence we want these AI tools to support us to increase, because that's the key thing here. There's a real risk that the AI dumbs us down. If you look at the consumerization of AI, and if you look at the way that certain AI products are advertised, for example, Apple Intelligence is going to make our life effortless, then there is a temptation to see that these tools are things that will make our lives easier. But actually, this is a call for us to become more intelligent. This is a call for us to have to work harder cognitively because we now have these AI tools. Because if we don't do that, then we risk being dumbed down by them. So we need to think about human intelligence incredibly carefully. It's very important. Now, when I was writing this book back in 2017, there was a lot of talk about AI, generative AI, but a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and the way that we needed to create roadmaps for how it was going to change the workplace and how we needed to plan for that. Fair enough. At the time, I felt things were too uncertain for a roadmap really to be the most useful artifact that could be produced, because it felt to me, and it still does, that we're in a situation that you might compare to driving a car along a really foggy road. You've never driven along this road before, it's poorly lit, it's very foggy, you can't really see where you're going. You know, a roadmap's not that useful in that situation. What's much more useful in that situation is knowing that you've got reliable brakes, that you're a good driver, that you're not sleep deprived, that you're not under the influence of alcohol, that your car is reliable. It's about the capacities, not about the roadmap. And so that's why when I was writing this book, I wanted to understand more about human intelligence and how human intelligence was different to artificial intelligence, and therefore the ways in which we needed to use the AI to increase the aspects of our human intelligence that are not actually yet accessible to AI. And so very simply, you know, we can think about our human intelligence as a very rich, complex set of capabilities that enable us. These are not separate intelligences. You know, our intelligence enables us to perform in these ways. Yes, we have our interdisciplinary academic intelligence, the kinds of things we do most of the time within the formal education system. We have our meta-knowing intelligence. That's about epistemic cognition. That's about understanding what knowledge is, where it comes from, being able to tell truth from fiction, increasingly important. Our social intelligence, the way we learn, the way we interact, and then a series of meta-intelligences, because as humans, we are able to plan, reflect, monitor, regulate our own thinking, our own emotions, our own awareness, our awareness of our physical presence in the world. And we can develop advanced, accurate, perceived self-efficacy. Now, these latter aspects of our human intelligence are not things that AI is yet good at doing. And so it's really important that we recognize the value of these sophisticated cognitive skills that we as humans have. And it's particularly important that as we inevitably offload some of our cognitive processing to our AI, that we offload the right aspects, not the ones that are really important for our sophisticated intelligent processing. If we look at what's happened with our memories, thanks to Google and other tools, search tools, and we think about the way that we navigate in the world now, thanks to GPS, we know our brains are changing, and they actually change more quickly than we previously thought. So we need to be really careful about what we have the AI do for us if we are going to become more sophisticated in our human intelligence, which is what I believe we must do. And so I said I was going to say something about change management, because I think in terms of adult learning and skills, this is a really important aspect of the story when it comes to AI. Now, I don't know how many of you know this book. It was a bestseller way back in the 90s. It's a change management book, and obviously called Who Moved My Cheese? And when I was writing the machine learning and human intelligence book, I was very struck by this particular book and the way that at that time, and even more so now, the change management aspect of what's happening with artificial intelligence is really important for those of us concerned about teaching, learning, education, and skill development. So in a nutshell, the book is a story of 4 characters who live in a cheese maze. And one day, 2 humans and 2 mice. And one day, the 4 characters wake up and discover there's no cheese. And the 2 mice kind of are used to such a scenario and scurry off and go off looking for more cheese in the maze. And the 2 humans have an argument, because one of them is just angry. You know, how dare they move my cheese? Who moved my cheese? I'm not doing anything. I want my cheese back. The other human realizes that perhaps there's something more proactive that could be done. And maybe there's a point in going off and looking to see if there are other places in the maze that have cheese. He tries to persuade his friend to go with him, but the friend is adamant that he's not moving at all. So our character, who's more proactive, goes off looking for more cheese in the cheese maze. And as he goes, he writes messages for his friend in case his friend ever decides to follow him. So you can see in the column on this slide, change happens. They keep moving the cheese. Anticipate change. Get ready for the cheese to move. So this is about classic change management. But I translated this for artificial intelligence because I think it's highly appropriate. We do need to be careful what aspects of our intelligence we allow the AI to do. Yes, computers keep going smarter, and intelligent tasks will increasingly move from human to machine. So we need to prepare intellectually for that. We need to constantly check in on our own intelligence to make sure we are keeping it fresh. We need to adapt. We need to offload the right intellectual activity to our AI. So we need to move with the times. We need to enjoy and relish the intellectual challenge of becoming more intelligent. As I said, I've never known learning to be effortless. So when I hear about Apple Intelligence making things effortless, I worry because I don't think learning is effortless. It requires strenuous mental effort. And so we need to make that strenuous mental effort enjoyable so that we enjoy being intelligent and never, ever feel that we're intelligent enough. So this is the kind of change management aspect of where I think we are with AI and GenAI in particular. But here's the wonderful finesse on this. So we have these AI tools that are precipitating the need for change. And at the same time, these same AI tools can really help us to become more intelligent because they can help us to understand our own intelligence much more deeply through the use of analytics. So this is just a mock-up, it's just an example. But if we think about that report I showed you earlier from the World Economic Forum about the new kinds of capabilities the workforce needs and the way in which those requirements are quite urgent. So we might present ourselves with a tool to help us, a Fitbit for the mind, to help us keep our intelligence fresh so that we're constantly building an understanding of our own intelligence. And say we're particularly interested in self-efficacy, so we're going to select that as the particular type of capability we want to build, and we're interested in motivation and self-awareness. Maybe this tool allows us to complete a diagnostic. Maybe we upload our data. Maybe it's tracking our data as we're working. But whatever, it gets access to our data and is able to analyze that with respect to our motivation and self-awareness. So we use the AI to extract from data about our interactions in the world insights relevant to that capability of motivation and self-awareness. And then we might get a nice individualized report that tells us about the extent to which we are keeping our motivation and self-awareness fresh. And of course, it could be any aspect of our intelligence. The idea behind this is to demonstrate that with AI tools and with the right curiosity, we can keep feeding our own intelligence and our understanding of our own intelligence in the same way that we track our fitness, physical fitness, many of us, we can track our intellectual fitness and the way in which we are becoming more sophisticated in our intelligence. So that's the kind of first, sort of mindset piece. But obviously, if we were going to do that, then people need to have a good understanding of data, because that's key to really understanding how to leverage these tools. And that's not necessarily straightforward. So how can we go about that? And this might be an approach you could adopt with educators as well as with students. So take a familiar concept, something like motivation. We know that we can measure motivation using traditional approaches, things like attendance, grades, number of library books taken out. But we can also add to the richness of the data that we can collect and analyze to understand more about motivation. Now, one way in which we can do this is by taking our understanding of what motivation is, how it works, how people become motivated, how it manifests itself, built up over a huge body of literature about human motivation and motivational learning. So we have this high-level concept that we can deconstruct to create a data proxy mapping, so that we can decompose the complex concept of motivation into tiny, tiny little subcomponents, and then look for data signals in the data that we collect as people are learning that we can map to these different aspects of motivation. So, for example, usually when we're talking about data about learners, you might have static and dynamic data. And in your static data, you'll probably have some demographic data. Dynamic, you might have academic data, and hopefully some log data. And then you can start to enhance this data. So you can think about the relationships between different aspects of the data that you're able to collect that can start to speak to different subcomponents of the concept of motivation. I hope you'll get a copy of these slides, because obviously I haven't got time to talk in detail about each aspect of this. But the point of the slide is to show how, by using each piece of data as an ingredient and building on combinations of data, you can get a much richer picture of what's happening. So this means that not only do we have the traditional ways of looking at a concept like motivation, we can also add extra data richness and then use AI in the analysis to start to help us to get new insights about a concept like motivation. So the idea is that we pick a familiar concept, motivation, and we help educators and students to understand more about ways in which data can be used in combination with AI to help them understand more about how their motivation is developing, or how their students' motivation is developing. Now let's take that a step further and think very specifically in the space of adult learning and skills, and think about something incredibly important, employability. So this is an example, again, trying to help people understand more about the power of data and AI when it comes to teaching, learning, development, and in this instance, employability. That was some work that we did with QA Higher Education on the idea of an employability course companion. So, for example, you might start off by thinking about the scope of such a construct. What kind of measurable outcomes would you want? You might explore the types of data that you have access to or could have access to that could be used to help measure employability. You might explore different learner use cases where you can generate that data, and then consider how the data that you're generating can be leveraged to boost what you understand about employability and retention. And so here are some examples of the sorts of features you might use to enable that data generation. It might be through frequent check-ins, interventions. You might have integration with existing institutional content. You might have portfolio generation. There's lots of different ways in which you can generate the data that would feed the model that you're building of employability. These are just some examples of how you might go about doing that. And then once you've done that, you can think about how this data-informed approach can build into the way that you support students. So you can think about augmented risk registers, where you're looking at a different approach to that rich granular insight. You can look at tracking attributes of successful students so you understand more the patterns that you want to instill in all students. And then you can feed that through into recommended interventions. So this is a particular example with respect to employability. So we've looked at mindset and we've looked at motivation as a tool, if you like, to help people engage with understanding more about the power of data. And now we're looking at the example of something like an employability companion as another way of using data to support teaching and learning. So the final point I want to make is one that's very pragmatic, and it's about how we might go about making all of those things a reality for students and those in the workforce. And that's through collaboration. I think one of the most powerful things that we could do is to focus on local lifelong learning hubs. I think at the moment, it's perfectly clear that not only is there an abundance of uncertainty in what's happening with AI, an abundance of uncertainty about exactly what the workplace will look like, what kinds of skills will be required. But there's also actually a lack of AI expertise. It's fine for me to stand here and say, right, we need to make sure everybody is educated about artificial intelligence so that they can use the tools effectively. That would be great, wouldn't it? But who's going to do that? So we don't have an abundance, particularly within the education and skills sector, of AI expertise. But maybe we do within our local communities. So perhaps a good way of really helping AI, and in this example, perhaps generative AI, but perhaps AI more generally, to be used effectively, but also to support people in their teaching and learning, is through this much more localized approach, where you have a community-based approach, collaborations between business, public sector, education, and a blended learning model of online and face-to-face, something, of course, the OU is absolutely fabulous at. And I think, therefore, you need to think about partnerships between schools, colleges, universities, leveraging existing community strengths in order to accelerate what can be done. Now, you probably will need to find ways to support communities where existing relationships are not strong enough, but there are many places where existing community relationships can be built on with the right partnership approach. And that way, everybody gets to benefit from sharing skills, expertise, and resources. Resources also being something that's often in short supply, as we know, within the education sector. So yes, you probably need, at a political level, you probably need an emergency catch-up fund for areas where there are not already existing community relationships, where you can address the areas most in need. And perhaps, ideas around pop-up learning hubs and convenient locations could be a really good way of helping build the right skills within the population for that locality. And I just love these AI generated images. So this one makes me laugh because I look at this image and I think, when was it ever a good idea to walk along reading a book in the street? Probably not. But that's what happens, as I say, with AI generated images, because of course that tacit understanding of how the world works is missing. But I think there's huge benefits to be had from this local approach. The contextualization of learning into community needs, building sustainable lifelong learning infrastructure, and addressing immediate skills gap, whilst at the same time planning for the future. So I'm proposing that we really need to think at the community level if we're going to tackle the real need to help upskill the population when it comes to AI. So I hope you found that interesting. I wanted to provide a very broad and practical presentation so that you can think about where we are now, as I said, with AI, both in terms of what it is when it comes to generative AI, but also the context within which that AI is being developed, the power imbalance, the difficulty in predicting the future, the uncertainty that we're facing, and then to think about what we can do practically. And so I've talked about mindset and needing to really embrace the fact that this is a moment in time when, as humans, we need to become more intelligent, not less intelligent. We need to make sure the AI doesn't dumb us down. We need to think about what it is that's created this AI. And it is that perfect storm between data, processing power, and powerful algorithms. So data is a really important aspect when it comes to understanding how to use these tools effectively. So how can we help people understand more about the power of data? I suggest using familiar learning concepts such as motivation. We then need to think, what does that mean practically? So if we are leveraging data more effectively so that we can use the AI, what does that mean in terms of practical benefits within the education sector? And I use the example of the employability companion. And then the final very practical point is about, well, how do we actually bring these benefits to bear? And I think that's where we need collaboration between different stakeholders within communities, because it's too much for the education sector alone to be able to deliver what's required when it comes to increased understanding of AI. And I think there are huge benefits to be gained from partnerships across sectors where we can all learn together, particularly within a local context. So I hope you found that interesting. If you want to know more about the kind of work that I'm doing at the moment, I host the EdTech podcast, and we've got a series of podcasts at the moment, just a couple coming out in the next couple of weeks, looking at AI specifically. We've had conversations with educators talking about the kinds of AI tools they're using and how they're using them. So do please have a listen. If you want to know more about the work that I'm doing with the company I founded, Educate Ventures Research, just click on that QR code, send us an email. It will go to a person, not an AI, and that person will respond to you and can tell you something about the work that we do. I hope that that's been useful. As I say, I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I would very much have liked to have been, but I hope that that has added something to your conference experience, and I'm very happy to answer any questions if there are any.
So, Rose, I have to say, I absolutely love Who Moved My Cheese. It was one of the books which was given to me about 20 years ago. And I do think it's something that actually we should recommend more. And I think one of the key things here is actually that adopting kind of change management and project management principles, and how you feel about that.
I think you're right. It's something that's hard, isn't it? It's so easy in a situation like this to focus specifically on the technology, because the technology is what's being pushed at us. But of course, it's the humans that matter, isn't it? And change management is all about that human development and that human ability to embrace the change and cope with the uncertainty. So I absolutely think it's a change management and a human intelligence story. And that's where we need to kind of pivot focus a bit, rather than just seeing it as a technology story. What I did want to say is, if anybody's got a question and they want to follow up with me afterwards, feel free to contact me on email or LinkedIn. I'll do my best to answer, because I know often you hear a presentation and the question doesn't come to you until half an hour later or whatever. So, I'm very happy to answer questions afterwards as well.
Lovely. Thank you, Rose. Really fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.